first cash cup of the season is over, and it was won on EU by Tillv1 and JulianCoM, names that not a lot of people may know, so let's jump into their gameplay and see exactly what they did and how they won. Their drop spot is to the north side of Sleepy Sounds. You'll see Tillv1 will land to the east side and loot these 4 houses in a U shape, whereas Julian will go to the west side of the north and loot these in what seems to be an S shape, and yes, you can see what that ends up spelling. Importantly, they end up with looting the metal last because this is very slow to harvest, but they basically get capped before they then disengage out of this drop spot. Very similar to any other team making sure that they get that metal in their drop spot. Now, because this is a 2-round cash cup, this is 6 games of stacked set lobby environment, which means that Storm Surge is a big issue, which means that now teams will have to actually focus on their positioning in second round of cash cups. So for game number 1, they position themselves over to this Shifty Shafts East Hill, and this was 2 minutes prior to the first zone closing. Very, very, very similar to what we've seen with a lot of the top teams and the places that they like to put themselves in, and at the time they like to put themselves in the zone, because any earlier than this, chances are you're going to miss out on your loot in the early game. Any later than this, someone's probably going to take the good Storm Surge position, so 2 minutes for that first zone close, always a good middle ground. Now this spot that they've chosen here for the particular zone is so good. I actually think this is probably the best spot for this particular zone. However, one of the little recommendations I would make is that you can see these 3 trees that are here that can easily be chopped down. I would probably chop these down just to ensure you have a little bit better sight lines over onto the Behemoth Bridge down on that kind of southwest side and the one below you, because this gives you a really nice sight line down to the river near Coney as well. In game number 2, the zone pulls more to the west, so they rotate slightly deeper into the zone over to the Behemoth Bridge instead this time. And since this is the lower position, Julian builds up 4 layers in metal to gain more of a line of sight, whilst Tillv1 reharvests the metal down below from the bridge so they can get themselves back up to. If you're going to put yourself not on a hill, you have to ensure that you go up a little bit higher to give yourself a better line of sight, because if you don't, you're not going to shoot anyone, because you're not going to see anyone rotating through. In game number 3, they were a little bit later to rotate, given the team pushed into Sleepy in the early game, so they rotated closer to the center of the first zones in Coney Crossroads. The sightlines from here weren't that great because they didn't really build up that high, as they could only really see to the east, but luckily because they were still close to the edge of the north side of the zone, they could hold a bunch of players from this side and were easily able to get tags and even an elimination in there as well. In game number 4, they played the same position on that hill as they did in game number 1. Game 5 was a south zone, however, which was fully far away from the drop spot, which is up to the north, so they took time to get a lot deeper into the zone and across the river, which allowed them to hold anyone rotating from the north, basically. They only went up 2 layers here, and I definitely think they should have gone up 1 more layer, because this would have easily opened up a lot more sight lines to the players who were rotating from that north down to the south. Now, game number 6, remember this is a set lobby environment, and they were in first, so Janice and Vortex did sneak up to their side of the drop spot to potentially see if they could pick up an elimination early on, because look, if you're second and you take out that team in first, you can easily win the whole tournament. But because they ended up being up near a boat, they ended up disengaging, keeping themselves away and safe, but this did scuff up the rest of their positioning throughout this final game. So because they weren't able to put themselves into a good Storm Surge position early on, they had to use a ton of heals, a ton of materials. Everything just looked dicey about this rotate, but quite frankly, it was probably required because Janice and Vortex ended up pushing in the early game. A part of the game that a lot of players seem to struggle at is definitely rotating to the 5th zone. It's an extremely difficult rotate if you pull a full max zone, in particular if you don't have a launch pad. So how did our winning team manage to do this in all 6 games? Well, firstly, 2 of the games, game 3 and 4, they pulled the 5th zone, so good RNG was on their side to start with. Game number 5 was extremely close to them, so they just basically walked in and ramped it straight away. Same with game number 6, to be honest. They were close to the 5th zone, and they didn't really have to use that many materials to rotate there. So for 4 out of the 6 games, they were definitely a bit lucky in the zone RNG that they got, because it was either on them or relatively close. However, game number 1 and game number 2, ironically 2 of their best games, they had close to maximum zones. So in this game number 1, they had to figure out how to rotate this basically max distance zone. Now, because of their drop spot that they're able to use their peppers that they had, this is the first time that they're going to actually use them. They pop them as the zone starts to close, which is important because everyone's going to be rotating here. And notice how they don't go through the edge of the map. They don't just start to go around the full edge, which I feel like a lot of players still think they would, but this is where the majority of players will actually be positioned on 5th zone. Not that many players are in the middle. So for them, they can just try and cut off line of sight and walk down the center. Now, there were bad people They were bad people in this game, and they did shoot Mustache and try to pick up eliminations rather than just rotating, but they basically used minimal materials on this rotate, and they took 0 damage between the two of them, which is extremely rare when you're rotating by foot to a max distance 5th zone. So great job from them rotating in this first game. In game number 2, it was similar. They had a close to max zone. However, this time they did have a launch pad, and they just full padded as that zone started to close. So again, the 2 games that they had to rotate max distance to, they started that rotate at the time where the zone started to close. Something that's been relatively similar throughout the majority of the season so far, unless you see an absolutely perfect opportunity. So the early and mid-game setup, getting to moving zones, is, in my opinion, more important than actually what you do in the moving zones. And that becomes apparent when you look at their loot in the 6th zone in comparison to the placement they got in that game. Notice the worst 2 games that they had, which were the final 2 games, games 5 and 6, were the 2 games where basically their loot was just the worst. The rotates weren't as good. They'd had a troublesome time. They got into fights they didn't need to. They utilized materials when they didn't need to. And that failed to set them up for a good endgame. Also note, let's be real, when we look at the inventories that they use, Till did not use a shotgun in a single one of the games, and in 2 of the 6 games, Julian did not use one either. So we know what the meta was starting to look like when it comes to fighting. Which is important when we look at their refreshes and the way that they took engagements, and it was just basically exactly what you would have thought it was. Spray with the SMGs and the Mark 7 ARs. Because of the drop spot on the north side of Sleepy, this gave them a ton of ammo in comparison to everyone else, because this is one of the highest concentrations of ammo boxes on the entire map right now. So they just have free reign to spray on whoever they want in the entire lobby. The issue with this is that if you had not of a great early and mid-game setup, when you're trying to fight people in endgame, it does become a bit 50-50 when you're just using the SMGs, because chances are they're doing the exact same thing back to you, meaning that it's a bit harder to get a ton of refreshes in the endgame. So if you don't have that good early and mid-game setup, it just compounds and gets even worse. So when you watch the way that they fought, yeah, you use their materials out, jump in a box, hit them with a bunch of shots of the SMG and hope that you hit more than them. It was a very 50-50 reliant style of fighting, just like pretty much everyone in this current meta. Now, this was before the nerfs to them. I put nerfs in air quotations. You can't see me, but that's what I'm doing. They've removed a couple bits of damage from this, but I still think this is just going to be exactly the same meta, despite the fact that this has been removed 2 damage per SMG rarity. But one of the things that did stand out to me a lot was the fact that they had a great understanding of where to tarp and their tarping abilities, always able to find dead side. Now, if you look at the first game, for example, they had peppers to pop, but they didn't instantly pop these. They knew they were in a scuffed position a little bit with a ton of players all the way around them, so they just spent the time to tarp out using their materials as they could. Because they had a good early and mid-game setup, they could afford to do this. Then once they got out, everyone else in the lobby will be launch padding at this particular moment. So then that's a time that they could pop their peppers and start rotating down the full edge of the zone, the dead side. Remember, there's basically no one here. They can use minimal materials to get through. Everyone else is either in the sky or just going down the center of the zone. So this was a super free rotate. And they did this in the majority of their end games. This is how they always found themselves onto a good path to rotate through. You can understand where the edges of the zone are and always try to intentionally tunnel towards those so that you can leave a side open, so you can keep away from the majority of players. However, you do have to be wary that you will be sprayed a lot in this meta. Hope you guys enjoyed this video and learned a lot. Peace.